Hey, welcome to another episode of The Cult of You with me, your host, Adam Knox. Today is a great day for me because I get to speak to one of my favorite authors, Mr. Duvendack of the Temple of Ascending Flame, as well as from 418 Ascendant. If you have ever seen this man's consistent feed of amazing astrological positions or predictions, you will know that Bill is the real deal. Not only one of the most researched authors out there in the left-hand path, author of so many books it is impossible to name them all, as well as contributions to newsletters, articles, temple pieces of material, as well as the popular podiums of the Nine Gatekeepers in the Becoming a Living God series. Bill is the real deal and an international astrologer. His work has really revolutionized this path, and today we sit down and break down some of the biggest key mistakes magicians make. We find out why your magic is working sometimes and failing at others. We also look at some of the serious roadblocks and issues not spoken about as we break down the inner game of magic. Bill brings some incredible insight and some blatantly honest points of view that may offend some occultists. But this is a beautiful interview where he shares with us his honest opinion and we go into depth with some really incredible subjects. If you want to learn more about Bill, please check out the interview section and you will find links to his websites as well as his courses and products where you can get in touch with him directly. Make sure you also send us an email with any questions you'd like to hear from Bill at info@thecult.co.za as we try and get this man to be on the show a little bit more often and bring his brilliant insights to life more regularly. Till then, sit back and enjoy the show and remember to live deliciously. Bull, thank you so much for joining me today here. I've been a big fan and a big supporter of your work for quite some time. In fact, I think, and a lot of people will agree with me, that you've been quite a revolutionary in this area for us, a real forward thinker and someone that's brought a lot of new information and a lot of well-researched information to the front, on top of being a pretty profound astrologer as well. So you're quite a well-rounded person from the left hand, the right hand aspects, even in terms of knowledge, quite a holistic approach. So thank you so much for sitting down with us today and having this conversation.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for the kind words. I'm just kind of me being me.
That perfect version of me is a great combination for the rest of us. So thank you very much for being yourself and bringing that forward. I want to start our Great. I want to start our conversation today with a very kind of basic question. I find that a lot of people approach this path from varying points of view. Some of them approach the spirits, the angels, the daemon, the gods, as if they are real individual entities with lives of their own, opinions of their own. Others approach it from it almost being a pure archetypical thing or a psychic manifestation of self. And there's also a lot of debates of what is self really in terms of that concept. I'd like to hear from you not only your point of view on this, but also your personal approach of relating to these forces.
Well, so first of all, are they objective beings? Of course. I don't think there's any denying that. Are they archetypal, psychological beings? Yeah, I don't think there's any debate about that. And a lot of people make the mistake because they think they have to choose which of those perspectives is true. And like a common internet meme that we see all the time, why can't it be both? And that's my operating stance, is that they may have started off as psychological forces or ideas or constructs thousands of years ago, but so many people have poured energy into them that they've now become autonomous beings. So we created the gods. That's about the only thing that I'll catch flack for sometimes, is people will say, well, did the gods create us or did we create them? And I do come down on the side of the fence that we created them, because if you wipe out all of our civilization, they're not going to exist.
Very interesting point. Running on that idea, and I really like where you're kind of coming from in that approach. Would we then say that an individual, in order to make contact with one of these dimensions, it's doing the ritual, doing the basic technique is one component, but would they have to cultivate that dimension of themselves, almost as a way to get a greater level of attraction? What's your view on that?
I completely agree. That's one of the first teachings in Magick, is you want, when it comes to evocation or invocation, you want your temple to be a comfortable place for the beings that you're inviting in. So you want it to resonate with them. Now, that is a temple example, but if you think of it in one's life, like we're talking about, well, that means that you do have to take on characteristics of that deity to invite them in and let them know that you're working with them because you're harmonizing with them. One of my favorites actually is in the scenery behind you is Shiva. I love working with Shiva, and it's all about the expansion of consciousness. So what you have to do is you have to mentally push your boundaries. You have to mentally push your consciousness. So if somebody tells you something and you immediately have a negative view of it, then you have to stop yourself and say, well, why am I being so negative about it? Even if you're still negative after you process it, you still have to think about it, because that changes your frequency to resonate more with Shiva, where Shiva aligns with you because you're not taking a dogmatic approach. You're actually questioning, and that's the first step of consciousness expansion. So yeah, you do have to embody that. And you know, this is kind of a sticky thing, because you have to embody it, but you have to control it. You can't become so enamored with the idea of embodying these traits of a deity that you forget basic concepts of being a human.
Is that almost like in the idea of someone being overwhelmed with their own lust or their own rage or their own anger, either being possessed by it and just acting about it, or learning to mature it in a way?
Exactly. A friend of mine many years ago was getting a dog, and she was debating on naming it Kali. And she decided not to, because she didn't want all of that angst, anger, aggressive energy in a puppy that she was trying to tame. You know, I know several mothers that have daughters that they named Lily, and they meant it as short for Lilith. And then when those daughters go through life experiences that mimic a lot of what are found in the stories of Lilith, then the mothers are surprised. You have no right to be surprised. You created this nightmare. You didn't do your research, or you didn't say, well, I like the change aspect of Kali, but I don't like the darkness. So let's look for another goddess that is similar but not the same, because we don't want my daughter to have anger issues.
This is a very interesting kind of piece, because again, we read, even for parents and their relationship with their children, the notion of how unconscious components is kind of coming through in terms of their relationship. Could there be a similar component here? If I'm naming a thing, whether that is an individual or a talisman of whatever nature, and I'm attributing those powers to it, is my own unconscious projections and where I am at in my relationship with that what's really coming through, or am I going to manifest a lot of other components that I don't even have awareness of?
Well, I think it's going to be a little bit of both. And the answer to that is subjective to how evolved the practitioner is. You know, everybody projects. People can say they don't, but they do. So if everybody's doing it, then the test is you want to be aware of what you're projecting, and you want to do your best to control it so that it's not a subconscious projection, it's a conscious projection. What you're talking about are the people that subconsciously dump into things, and then it turns out to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then they think, well, woe is me, the victim. If you were conscious of your projections, then you'd be conscious of what to leave out. So the trick is you want to be conscious of your projections.
Okay, thank you. All right, that brings me to my next question, actually, because one of the things I think that we're touching on is that it's your relationship as the practitioner with these internal archetypes, and how that is a talismanic image, so to speak, of the greater, the microcosm, the macrocosm. You know, something we've heard so many times and is preaching to the choir, really, but I don't think a lot of people take it's at such a deep and honest level. So when it comes to specifically our personal and spiritual development, the way we approach this, if we look at the kind of default map that a lot of us have as, are kind of born with, which many would say is the astrological map, our horoscope, that initial kind of base configuration, so to speak. Our path as practitioners, is it, or rather, purely focused on the maturing and the refining of those components within ourselves, i.e. the planetary components as they manifest? Or does this expand to, for example, almost like a hero's journey, if you will, through my own zodiacal position, maturing and refining that, moving into the next? Is that even a possibility from your point of view? Could you touch on that for us?
It is, and this is something I talk about in, I think it's Astrology in Theory and Practice and Qliphothic astrology. The idea that each astrological sign is a spectrum. So you can have a lower evolved person in a sign, and you can have a higher evolved person in the same sign, and they don't look anything alike. That becomes the journey of becoming. That's one of the reasons that I enjoy reading a lot of Setian material, because it's all about the becoming process, the coming into being. And that's what life is. We're down here to journey from point A with our birth all the way up until death. And all we'll have to show for it is the results of our spiritual and personal development work. So it is a journey of a hero, but by that same token, you never 100% leave it. It's always on you. And this is why I don't share this often, but I think you'll appreciate this. This is why I give credibility to the Roman Catholic idea of original sin.
Yes.
Because if we were complete, we would not be in physical form doing our growth and development. We would be complete autonomous beings. The fact that we are physically incarnated means there is something like an original sin or a fatal flaw that we're working through in this lifetime to heal it.
Interesting perspective.
Right. You can't really say it's a sin because sin implies something wrong.
Yes.
But there is some wisdom in that we are flawed because we're down here working through karma.
I like that frame. I do like that frame. I find there's a lot of people look at, for example, the Qliphothic work or the darker work, and even the Gnostic kind of view of the serpent coming into the garden and leading us into that original sin. Not that it is necessarily the negative, but it's that first transmutation, that first journey for us to actualize in full form. And I believe one of the translations of the name of God in the burning bush, which is actually more of an I will be that which I will be instead of an I am that I am, denoting this eros evolutionary principle, which again, the erotic principle combined with the concept of original sin, the fundamental impulse to our evolution and our growth. But speaking of that, talking about that, so a lot of people kind of get stuck on that. They're accepting of that idea. And you see it a lot, very commonly, I think, with people starting off in the left-hand path from a commercialized point of view. You know, they wear the pentacles, they overdress with the golf shirts and stuff like that, instead of going internal and realizing what it's deeper about. That pathway of recognition, maturing, which is almost alchemical, how would you advise somebody to approach that? And what do you think are core tools to help them? Because we mentioned earlier about being conscious of those items. And I mean, just making that statement to an individual, unless they're very well researched, it's not something they immediately grasp. What is your view or your advice in terms of that?
So first of all, let me say, I've never been someone that follows the fucking herd. So my view is going to be skewed, because my view is all based on being the outsider for most of my life. So take it with a grain of salt. But that is the first lesson of the left-hand path. You realize not everybody's going to understand what you're working with, so don't fucking broadcast it. You're painting a target on your back.
Yes.
You know, I talked about this in an article in The Way of the Serpent anthology from Lodge Magnet a number of years ago, and the name of the article was "Mental Perils on the Path of the Serpent," and the whole article was about what we're talking about. Just because you walk with the left-hand path does not mean you have to look a certain way or behave a certain way. If it's really individualized, like people say it is, you can be however you want to be, and you'd better be accepted if you know your shit. So to people that are just starting off, I'd say be yourself. Don't feel like you have to change to accommodate someone else's vision. That's their life. That's not yours. You and I both know politicians in our respective nations that are as evil as the most stereotyped left-hand path practitioners out there, but they're dressed in three-piece suits and go to church every Sunday.
This is a fact. This is a fact. and I also think one of the most common realizations should be, one of the tools that we utilize in ritual is the art of symbolism. And if an individual is not recognizing that the way they dress, the way they behave is symbolic to the unconscious of the other individual, and if they're not getting the results, because magic fundamentally, for me at least, is the result of the communication we're putting out, both consciously and unconsciously. And if we want to give changes, it's not just about a quick fix ritual, but it's also about becoming aware of what are the unconscious rituals we're performing all the time. You know, what is that? And how do we start bringing that about? So is it effective or is it not effective? But in terms of that, is it something that someone approaches with invocation and evocation to bring in higher awareness in themselves? Has it to be coupled with some kind of personal therapy? Is work through astrological archetypes useful? What is an advisable tool set, you know, to look at if you've got to name one or two?
First of all, the biggest tool set is the one you just mentioned, symbolism. Micromanage your symbolism. Pay attention to your symbolism. In my books and in my classes, you'll never see an inverted cross because that's the cross of Peter. So it's a Christian symbol. So why would I use it? I'm not Christian.
Well said. Well said.
You know, so know your symbolism, apply your symbolism appropriately. There is a perspective out there that the more that you have a symbolism around you, or the more you use particular language, you are changing the energy of that to where it's more pedestrian. And I don't 100% agree with that, but that is a valid perspective. And if people think of it that way, then they're more discreet with their application of symbol. You know, there's a teaching that I'm kind of surprised the way this played out, but in Native American traditions, specifically in the Cherokee tribe, they believe that if you do a ritual a long time, like back to back, or it's been around for centuries, eventually that ritual loses its power and you can't use it anymore.
Interesting.
Because you work with it, you get the same results, that becomes your new baseline. Then there's nothing for that ritual to help you with.
This makes an interesting degree of sense. Even one of the phrases from all traditional magic was that the name of God was powerful in the hands of an adept, but useless in the hands of a neophyte. Again, the neophyte doesn't have that preconditioning of the symbol. They don't have a relationship with it. In fact, they may have a counter relationship, I think. And this is something because one of your books about psychic self-defense, and this is something that you speak about as well. And I'd like to kind of just touch on these ideas in relationship to that in terms of how we protect ourselves. Do we even need protection in certain instances? Or I love what we spoke about in terms of why use a cross if it's not really part of your pantheon. If it's not part of your archetypal symbology, in fact, it may be quite contradictory. And is that often a case of people starting off this path, still in the background of their brain, having very Christianized versions of these entities, and then technically causing their own suffering, so to speak?
Well, and you bring up an important point. Oftentimes that people, they leave Christianity because they had some horrible instance or whatever. So they come into this path with a whole bunch of baggage. They try and make this path the exact opposite of Christian, but they don't know how to do that because their mind is still locked into that Christian paradigm and seeing this path as a subset of it. And the person projects, well, I'm no longer Christian, I must be the opposite, but then they project what they think the opposite is.
This is a very
so not only should you be looking at your symbolism like we talked about as one tool set, another one is basic networking. Get to know your community. I don't believe people anymore when they say they're fucking solitary because of the internet. It connects people around the world.
It's, I think, this interesting hallucination because I always say that if we look at the 6 human needs in human evolutionary psychology or developmental psychology, and I find that those 6 human needs can also be very nicely tied in with the planets as these archetypal components of ourselves. And every time I see somebody just posting a lot of that stuff, it's kind of like when people want to do a ritual to a certain entity, but then they have to go blast it on social media that they did the ritual to that entity, as if it's some kind of validation. And what we're seeing here is just somebody, in my opinion, that's trying to meet these base level needs. And I think as magic practitioners, this is the psychological buffer that we need to get past. Even the concept of clairvoyant to become clear seeing, the first stage of the messages are usually messages for myself, are they not? Before we progress.
Exactly. And that formula of the 6 basic needs, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I think that should be mandatory to learn when you're first starting off on the path. Because I think everybody should be familiar with it, but especially if you're working with these kind of energetics, you should know what those needs are. You should make sure that they're met. I learned a long time ago, you never take psychic and spiritual advice from someone who can't pay the fucking bills on a regular basis.
Very well said. Very well said.
I'm sorry, you just don't. You can listen to them. There is something to be learned from them, even if what you learn is not to be like them. Now, if you've got somebody that lives in their parents' basement because they're taking care of their elderly parents, that's a whole different situation. But someone who has no stability.
But I think this is the fact. Again, we live in the information age today. And for people to be spouting off knowledge because they've read a few grimoires or a few magical texts, and oftentimes they're just regurgitating someone else's work in most cases, but they haven't come to that point of ownership of that information. And again, unless they do, there's an incongruence. I know Ken Wilber speaks about his model of development and how somebody can at certain stages be at a more integral level. They may be spouting off great wisdom and great genius, but these other components of themselves may be completely underdeveloped and maybe still functioning almost in an infant-like stage because they haven't taken that ownership yet. And I think anyone that's truly walked the dark path has to have come not only to true pain inside of their life at some degree, but has mastered it. has overcome it in some way, shape, or form and translated that suffering into art, which is a very important component. Is that something you agree with?
Oh, I completely agree with that. And ownership it's difficult for a lot of people these days. You know, I learned a trick back in 2004, 2003. Some things in my life were not the way I wanted. So I was standing in front of my bathroom mirror, looking myself in the eye saying, this is your fault. And then when I got shit straightened out a few years later, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and said, this is your fault.
Nice.
It keeps you balanced. You got to take ownership. Otherwise, you're playing the victim mentality, so you are not evolved at all. You're the prey, not the predator.
Yeah, I think that's so key. One of the attitudes that I see with a lot of kind of magicians is, or not, you know, little startups or neophytes or beginners, people that, even ones that have been in it for a while, but they're not kind of dealing with that inner game of magic, you know, if we can call it that, is this almost release of responsibility. I've done the ritual, I've poured blood in a thing, or I've followed these steps, and I might have had a little bit of soft experience or larger experience, and that's where it's left. You know, not, oh, I've got to now take action and still follow through with the inspirations and the ideas. In your view, is there a case where the entity or the force can't take care of the full situation? Or is there always a degree of action that is necessary from your point of view, from the individual? And what may be, and this is a bit of a loaded question, but what may be some of the factors that prevent them from following through on that action that should be addressed?
Well, so first of all, I think there are definitely situations where an entity will step in and do it for you without you doing the prerequisite work. I've had those experiences, and I know other people that have had those experiences. So it is entirely possible. But I also agree, for context, that's in the minority. Usually the being helps you see what you need to do, and then you do it. Or you contact the being saying, hey, I'm doing this. I just want a little assistance to either make it easier or enlarge my results. You know, it's more of a mutual exchange most times. So then the responsibility is on the person to say, I'm not going to rely on that deity to do it for me. I'm going to do it myself, but I'm going to recognize that when I did the ritual to ask this deity for help, they're not going to do it for me. They'll just grease the wheels a little.
Okay. And in terms of that, because I think anyone that has practiced for a period of time has had experiences where, you know, phenomenal, literal magical results manifest in sometimes instantaneous ways and profound ways and things like that. What do you believe are some of the core factors around this? Is it a case of the individual's relationship with an entity, and is that something built over time, or is it a happenstance thing? Is it a case of I happen to fall into the right astrological alignment at the right time? What are the things that we should be focusing on to develop that deeper relationship as well?
I think the biggest one, and luckily, the more we go into this century, the more common it is. I think the biggest one is just understanding that we are magic. It's not something you do in a ritual circle and you put it in a little box with a little bow on it and you go about your life. You're a living, breathing embodiment of being in that ritual circle and in being outside of it. So taking responsibility to say, this path is going to change me. I should be open to letting it change me. So that's piece number one. Something else is just awareness of what beings or what entities, what their traits are. You know, I've known enough Thelemites over the years that have chased their Scarlet Woman or Babylon, and they usually get her, and then she turns out to be too much of a woman for them. Or somebody wants the BDSM side of Lilith, so they do a ritual to Lilith, and next thing you know, they're playing the role of a cuckold. You can't part and parcel aspects of these beings' psyche. If you're working with a being, yes, you should specify, I want your help with this, but you better understand you're gonna get part of their personality in it. So you better be comfortable. And this is why I do so many of my books are research heavy. Know the being before you engage in a conversation with them. If you and I are walking down the street, we'll meet somebody randomly. We can't research them. But when we're talking about deities that show up or that we call, we can take our time and get to know them before we actually know them. It's kind of an advantage we've got.
A definitely useful one. And in terms of that, as I start, because this is a bit of a two-sided kind of question, and it is that at certain points a practitioner may be having great success. It's an internal thing, it's a mood thing, it's an alignment thing, and then there's other times where no matter what they do in terms of the ritual, they're still not getting the results. I'd like to hear your view on that.
I think it's two things. First of all, astrology, because the transits in the sky are going to be interacting with your chart differently at one time than another. So learning astrology enough to where you can say, oh, I'm about to have this life cycle come up. I'm going to mentally shift my magical style to compensate.
Okay.
So that's piece number one. And then the other one is really just spiritual initiations.
Can you
what
expand
you're
on that
doing
one for us?
before, right? What you're doing before, it worked then, but now it's time to use a video game term. Now it's time for a level break. Now it's time to level up and change what you're doing in line with who you are now.
So one could almost say that there's a similar. I like the idea that magic, to a certain degree, is almost like a psychic gym. In the sense of I go into the temple, I do that work, but the same way, whether I'm doing yoga or I'm doing any kind of physical gym, if I'm just doing the same routine over and over again, and you mentioned this earlier, it's almost like it desensitizes to a certain degrees and it stops having that same effect. I need to almost enrich the art, again, revive it within myself in order to get that same level of energy to that same height, so to speak.
Exactly. And at the same time, you have to recognize, when I started, I was here and could only handle this much energy. Now I'm here and I can handle a lot more. Then if I want to continue to evolve, more energy is going to be a possibility. So I have to adjust what I'm doing to hold greater amounts or a different manifestation. This is something, this is a running joke I learned from many years in business, which is when you're doing something for yourself in your own life and you work for someone else, if you have a $500 car repair bill, you're shelling out that $500, but you're not real comfortable about shelling out $500. When you own your own business, you think you're uncomfortable shelling out checks for $500. When we're talking several $1,000s, you got to be comfortable doing that too. And the first few times you're not comfortable. It's a level break. It's a shift in consciousness. And I think that can be used as a parallel for what a lot of people do. When you start off, you're working with that $500 ideas. But if you're doing any kind of evolution, it's going to hit more of those thousands of dollars, and it's going to take a period of adjustment. But once you get through that period of adjustment, you're going to be just as comfortable doing that as you were on the smaller scale.
Could we almost say that this is part and parcel with the entire notion of self-sacrifice, and sacrifice being a necessary component of the magical work? How it's often, and I know in some of the works shared from the temple itself, where you speak about that some of the most powerful blood is your own blood, and that it's an act of self-sacrifice. Could we then also say that in terms of my progression of my magic, my level of sacrifice needs to also increase? This constant burning of the ego, burning of my limitations in order to reach the new heights. Is that an accurate description?
Yeah, I completely agree. And to help with that, viewers should remember that the definition of the word sacrifice, it is to give up, but it's to make something sacred. When you sacrifice something, you're putting bookends on it in time, saying that it existed from this point to this point. Now I'm done with it. I'm going to put it on a shelf, It's going to create more space for things to come into my life. And I can also look back on that memory and cherish it.
That's
See,
powerful.
too many people see sacrifice as a negative thing. I don't. Because when you sacrifice, you put it off or you surrender it, you're saying that was a part of me. I honor it. I respect it. But now it's no longer a part of it.
That it's such a key idea. I think a great place, just outside of, I would say, not even ritual magic, but in terms of communal magic. If we look at the burns, Africa burn in South Africa, Burning Man in the States, and those kinds of events where a group come together and produce something over a period of time that has large value just because of the investment of energy, and then burns that. And everyone reports a massively cathartic, self-transformative experience as a result of that sacrifice of something that's been created specifically for that purpose. Yet we do the same thing with the internal temples or archetypes that we produce of ourselves. And I think this is very, like, I love that we can talk about this, especially coming from your background and your insight, the archetypes, specifically if I look at the planetary, deities and how those are reflections of myself. So I should then also be, to a degree, in order for me to achieve almost the next rank or the next position or next level in terms of Venus or Jupiter or Mercury, I need to be willing, and is this accurate, to sacrifice my current level and my current stage in order to get that? Or how would you interpret that?
No, I completely agree. This is something that I see come up with prosperity magic a lot. People will do a ritual to make $100,000 a year, and they'll either get a job offer or they'll get a promotion or they'll get an opportunity to work overtime. Fast forward several months, they're complaining about getting what they wanted, because if they're working overtime, they don't have any time to spend the money. If they got a new job, new responsibilities go with it to justify the higher salary. People have it stuck in their mind. They're trying to get something for nothing. A great example of sacrifice is if you love your personal freedom, but you don't make any money, then you might have to sacrifice some of that freedom to make some money. And not everybody's willing to give things up like that. They want both. They want the $100,000, but they're not willing to give up anything to make it happen. If somebody wants a house with a white picket fence and 2.5 kids in the yard, they're going to have to do the things that can make that happen.
This is a fact. And I think I like for me, a rough, easy translation of karma that's just a bit more practical for people is the idea of habit. Our karma, to a degree, is the summary of our various unconscious habits. So what I think what we're saying here is that you can do the ritual, and it's kind of like the low magic approach in the old definitions of something that creates a quick, instantaneous results and brings about change. But unless you've taken the high magic, the theurgic transformation, unless you've gone in and given up the habits or installed the new habits that you oftentimes get as inspiration, or guidance from the ritual, from the meditation, from the path working, you're going to ultimately be sabotaging yourself back to that level. And again, this is the self that needs to consistently be sacrificed. But how do we do that? I mean, there's tons of psychological techniques and methods, but from a magical point of view, how do we approach that?
So the first thing to do is prioritize what matters the most in your life. Then you put that up against the model of the hierarchy of needs, and you use that as a filtration system. Well, I cherish this, but it's not fulfilling any needs. Therefore, it can possibly be sacrificed.
Okay.
That's how you create your sacrifice list.
Your internal hierarchy.
What's that?
Your internal hierarchy of, shall we say, heaven and hell, if you want to call it that, pain, pleasure, psychology, and what needs to be transmuted.
Exactly. No, you're 100% right. It is that internal heaven and hell duality. It is that internal nirvana, where you're searching for that bliss, And part of finding that bliss is in moderation between those two poles.
Yes, yes.
So then the answer becomes subjective, because you will come to a point where you say, I've got nothing left to sacrifice.
And
then what?
Is this kind of the achievement of a person? I say that occult purity is not, the hallucinated right-hand path kind of purity. It's not, I abstain from wine, I abstain from sex or anything like that. It's purity purely means, in my interpretation, of pure alignment. Like a values, principle, spiritual path alignment. I am not going, oh, I want to have better sex or better money or better, spiritual connection, yet I'm piling that on with contradictions in my habits and in my belief systems. I've cleared that out. How do we recognize when we are actually at that place versus when we are deluding ourselves because we're still holding on to an unconscious thing? What are maybe some telltale signs that give that to us, and what should we do when we hit those thresholds?
Well, I think the biggest telltale sign is you look at the road behind you. If you've never done any spiritual work and you're feeling like you're at that point, you ain't at that point. Mm-hmm. Because we're talking about more advanced ideas, and there's probably going to be some people that hear this and don't like what I got to say, but it illustrates the point. If you're 18 and you've never been in the military and you came from a middle class background and you're trying to tell me that you're tired of the world, sorry, no sympathy here. Mm. You haven't even touched the world.
This is true.
So part of it has to do with that kind of perspective. Saying, okay, maybe I just don't know enough. Maybe I haven't done enough practice. So when you feel that you're starting to hit that stagnant point or that transcendent point, you got to look back and say, have my actions and beliefs and behavior led to this point? Because it could be you look back and you say, no, I'm just in a mental funk. And so then you would seek proper psychological help or whatever you need to correct you. But if you look back and you're like, oh yeah, for the last 2 years, I've been destroying the ego. Well, then congratulations. You are now reaping the benefits of a destroyed ego.
We are coming close to like our time for today, which is very, very sad for me because I've actually got an endless list of questions I still want to throw at you. But
that's why we'll do more of these.
That's fantastic. I think everyone listening is very happy to hear that. I know I am. I want to, there's another question that I've been burning to kind of ask you, and I want to bring this up. One of the things that we find tons of correspondence and books and materials about is this map of the Shema Meferas related to the entities of the Goetia, related to the zodiac. And we've all seen these symbols and these pathways before. And I know different authors also speak around the idea that the common zodiac is almost like the controlled space. So if I take my interpretation of that, it's kind of like the old gods versus the new gods, the gods of reason, logic. It's the crystallization of these, shall we say, chaotic dark matter kind of forces. Is it accurate that as my kundalini or my sexual identity, my fundamental self begins to evolve and transmute, and I start to correct, align, balance, refine, purify these components, do I, after that, start to venture into the Qliphothic or the counter spaces of that? Or are they correlated? Do I do the one and the other at the same time? And what's the paradigm that I should be holding in mind when I'm looking at that?
So there's actually a very powerful principle of Sephirotic magic here that we're talking about. Let's say you want to do a working to Hod, which is Mercury. So you do a working to invite that Mercury spirit into your life. And as you do it, you realize that you're getting everything that you wanted in the ritual, but you're also having to deal with a bunch of liars and tricksters and thieves in the process. The reason before that is because you didn't specify you wanted the Hod aspect. You just said you wanted the Mercury aspect, and part of Mercury is the Samael side from the Qliphoth. And Mercury is known as the Prince of Thieves.
Very nicely put.
And this is a secret that I'm glad a lot of beginning practitioners might hear, because you want to specify. If you don't specify, you're going to get both. And if you're not ready for it, it's going to fuck you up.
Properly.
Right, exactly. But if you know, then you can say, well, I just want to work with the Samael side of Mercury, or I just want to work with the Hode essence of Mercury, not the Samael. If you don't make that distinction in ritual with your own work, you're going to get both. So that's how to prevent what you're describing. Now, you can be masochistic and say, fuck it, I'll just take both. You can do that, but I hope it does its job for you, because it's a pain in the ass on the back end.
That's interesting. Is this also why there's such mixed pieces out there? For example, Astarte and Astaroth, and the relationship between the symbols being so similarly close that in working with Astarte, you're almost invoking that love component, so to speak. But in working with the Astaroth component, you're working with a more destructive. Just as an example, is that inaccurate?
Yeah, no, that's accurate. Yeah, that's completely accurate.
So then in terms of that discussion, if, for example, taking on the Mercury component, if I'm purely invoking that mercurial aspect, I'm fundamentally going to get both. And depending on where I am in my inner work, is that going to play a big role in determining what of those components are manifesting and how they are how they're being drunk up into my life?
Yes. And you kind of touched on this earlier, where you've got to know the characteristics of the being you're working with, but also if you are working, be aware. You have to be aware of yourself. You have to be aware of what they bring to the table, and you agree when you work with them to work within that parameter. And that's what makes it tricky, because there's no way a human can understand the consciousness of these beings. They are using an agenda that we might not be able to understand. So they have us at a disadvantage, which is why it's important to be specific with our desire.
That's, I think, a great frame. And when we're being specific in that, and I'm gonna wrap up shortly with this one, because again, I think we can just keep going. This is a rabbit hole, and it's never gonna end. This is really great content. When we're being specific, is it purely because, again, we see mixed symbols, mixed ends, mixed ways to approach the ritual? Is it that? Is it very much which end, which sigil, which ritual? Or is it also how we are languaging the thing inside of the request, as well as the psychic relationship that we're perceiving? Or is it just one or the other that has more dominance? So in other words, if I'm doing a certain ritual or an aspect, for example, to Astarte, but in the background of my mind, I have this, what if I bring Astaroth kind of more through into that situation? Is that a problem I have to resolve before I go into the ritual with maybe more research or maybe more stuff? Or is the single act of using a different sigil with that focus and attribute enough?
I generally see it as work it out before you step in the ritual.
Okay.
Come to your own peace with it before you do your ritual work. Have your own understanding of it. And some people don't like hearing that because they really want to work with this being, but there's certain parts of it that are dangerous. Work out that baggage in your head before you even start that ritual.
This is a fact. This is a core fact.
Yeah.
Last question. What do you think is probably some of the, besides all the stuff that we've spoken about, because I think we've had so many great ideas here. And I think for the new practitioner, they bring a lot of things into context, because again, these are the things when I just pick up a random, new book on magic or new book on grammar, these are the things that aren't usually discussed, is that inner game or these inner components. And, thank you so much for helping us kind of bring that to people's minds. If somebody's doing that work, what is and they're still not getting the results, inside of themselves, how are they sabotaging? What do you believe is some of the other core contributing factors about why people fail at, their magic, so to speak?
One is a lack of understanding of results. A lot of people want to do the ritual. They want that manifestation, but they can't recognize the opportunities that come their way in life that will bring them closer to that goal. Maybe it's the wrong ritual style. Maybe you're doing blood magic and it's not what you connect with. Maybe you're doing ceremonial magic and you should be doing witchcraft instead.
That's interesting.
So the biggest thing is keeping your ego in check and experimenting to see what fits the best and what's most appropriate to the situation.
Okay. So we could say there's almost like two things that I'm hearing there. One is maybe your strategy is incorrect for your personality type or your energetic type, so to speak. And you need to be willing to experiment and shift that a little bit. And the second one is having almost a disillusion of how this thing can manifest, almost like the Hollywood thinking of like, beings of light or beings of darkness are going to suddenly appear and grant my wish like a genie out of a bottle, instead of realizing, instead of just knowing that that feeling that I got, or that little idea that I've got, is now the thing that I need to go act upon. Is that correct?
Right. Exactly. Those two things are the main two. And if you make adjustments and neither one of those solve your problems, quit doing ritual work and go back to reading about quantum physics, about the basics of energy movement and vibration in the papers of Nikola Tesla. Start looking at the more scientific, fundamental understanding of energy.
I love
because
that.
That's all magic is that manipulation of it.
I love that. It's not a quick one-hit bullet. A one-kick wonder that a lot of people kind of think it is. It's not. Magic isn't magic in the sense of Hollywood. Magic is science, and it has to have the foundations.
Exactly. The method of science, the aim of religion.
Perfect. Bill, thank you so very much. It's been great having you, and I think everyone loved hearing your ideas and your concepts, and getting a little bit closer to the man behind the books and all the other amazing ideas that you keep bringing out, which is exciting and fantastic. So thank you very much from the bottom of my heart for being here and sharing your wisdom, and I hope we see you again.
Oh, thanks for the offer. I'd gladly be here again.